When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, Europe was thrown into chaos. Roads cracked, trade stopped, and order disappeared. Amid this turmoil, one institution endured, the Christian Church becoming a beacon in the darkness. With Rome gone, bishops and popes stepped up to fill the power void left behind. But the Church's rise wasn't just spiritual. It quickly learned to wield political influence, control wealth, and shape nations' futures. After the fall of Rome, the Church stepped into its place, taking on the authority once held by emperors. Bishops began wearing robes that reminded people of Roman senators, linking old power with new leadership. The Church's grand basilicas were modeled after Roman halls, blending tradition with holiness. Latin prayers echoed through these sacred spaces, carrying on the language of Rome but with a new purpose. In place of the emperor's sword, the cross became the symbol of eternal salvation for many. For those seeking hope, the Church offered guidance and salvation, making priests the new spiritual leaders. In a world gripped by famine, plague, and endless war, people sought something certain. The Church offered that certainty. Obey its rules and you'd reach heaven. Disobey and you'd suffer eternal hellfire. This promise gave the Church more power over people's souls than any army had over their lands. While kings ruled territories, the Church ruled the hearts and minds of the people. In medieval times, popes didn't just guide faith. They claimed to be God's representatives on earth. They crowned emperors and even demanded kings get down on their knees in submission. When the mighty Holy Roman emperors bowed, no ruler could ignore the Pope's authority. Behind this spiritual facade lay a harsh truth. The Church wielded absolute political power. One famous moment was Emperor Henry IV kneeling in the snow, humbling himself before Pope Gregory VII. By the 10th century, the Church had become one of Europe's richest landowners. It collected tithes, compulsory donations, and even seized entire estates from the people. While cathedrals rose like stone giants, many peasants faced hunger and hardship outside their walls. Inside, treasures gleamed in golden chalices and jeweled relics, secured in vaults and on altars. Beneath sermons extolling poverty, the Church secretly hoarded wealth rivaling the richest kingdoms. Excommunication was the Church's ultimate weapon, cutting off kings and commoners alike from the very hope of heaven. For a king who defied Rome, it meant losing both divine favor and the loyalty of his subjects. For ordinary people, excommunication meant being cast out from the community, living with shame and fear of eternal damnation. The Church didn't need swords. It controlled through the power of fear itself. During the Middle Ages, the Church held tight control over all learning. Latin was their secret weapon. From scripture to laws, everything was written in a language only priests could understand. Ordinary people were not allowed to read the Bible or access this knowledge. Trying to learn on your own was seen as dangerous heresy, punishable by death. In the 12th century, the Church launched the Inquisition to stamp out anything they saw as heresy. Inquisitors held absolute authority to arrest, question, and punish anyone suspected of turning away from the faith. This unchecked power created a climate of terror where even neighbors could accuse each other, often with deadly results. Many accused disappeared without a trace, leaving fear to spread like wildfire through communities. Throughout history, iron racks, thumbscrews, whips, and branding irons were cruelly used, yet justified by the Church as a means to save the soul. Victims were told, better to burn for an hour on earth than for eternity in hell, a brutal message hiding behind a mask of supposed righteousness. This terrifying cruelty was considered a grim form of salvation, blending pain with misguided faith and authority. Back in medieval times, groups like the Cathars and Waldensians stood up and demanded a purer, corruption-free faith. But their bravery came at a price, as the Church branded them heretics and launched brutal attacks against them. Jan Hus was another bold voice who spoke out and was tragically burned for his beliefs. All they did was question the hidden abuses of priests and popes, hoping for truth and reform. In medieval times, the Church found a way to sell salvation called indulgences that let people pay to erase their sins. Wealthy nobles could buy their way out of damnation, while the common folk lived in fear, unable to afford such a costly escape. The trade in indulgences became one of the biggest scandals in Church history, even though very few dared to speak against it. By the 11th century, priests were officially forbidden to marry, embracing celibacy as a symbol of purity. But beneath this vow, a hidden world unfolded. Priests keeping mistresses and bishops fathering children. Whispers of corruption filled monasteries, secrets carefully guarded and records often destroyed. Back in the medieval times, accusations of witchcraft started to spread, often targeting women who were midwives, healers, or simply independent. These women were unfairly linked to the devil, sparking fear and suspicion within communities. The Church fueled this fear, turning accusations into public spectacles, with trials, torture, and even burnings. Communities were terrified into obedience as pyres were lit and accused witches were tied to stakes. These witch hunts left deep marks on society, showing how fear was used to control and silence. Back in 1095, when Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade, it was sold as a holy mission to reclaim Jerusalem. But beneath the surface, it was more about greed, power, and conquest than just faith. Crusaders committed terrible acts, looting, violence, and slaughter, all justified in the name of religion. The church wrapped these brutal actions in spiritual language, masking its real hunger for wealth and influence.
In 1209, the Albigensian Crusade brought brutal violence to the town of Béziers in southern France. When soldiers asked how to distinguish heretics from loyal Christians, the chilling order was given: kill them all, God will know his own. This ruthless command exposed the cruelty behind the crusade, despite its claim to be a holy mission. Entire neighborhoods were set ablaze, leaving destruction and despair in their wake. The massacre of Béziers remains a dark reminder of how faith was used to justify merciless violence. Back in medieval times, the church showcased thousands of relics, from fragments of the true cross to saints' bones. Many of these relics were actually forgeries, sold to pilgrims hoping for miracles and spiritual comfort. Entire local economies were built around these fake miracles, turning faith into a booming business. For the common people, these relics offered hope in difficult times, while the church gained immense wealth. Once mighty warriors bound by faith, the Knights Templar rose to great power and wealth across Europe. But in 1307, their fate took a dark turn when King Philip IV and Pope Clement V turned against them. Accused of grave crimes like heresy and blasphemy, many Templars faced brutal torture until they confessed to these charges. Ultimately, the mighty order was disbanded, and their vast riches were seized by the church and the crown. Their last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, met a tragic end at the stake, marking the final chapter of the Templars. In the 14th century, the Black Death swept across Europe, claiming nearly half of the population. The church struggled to explain the catastrophe, with priests saying it was God's punishment. Tragically, some blamed Jewish communities, sparking violent attacks and widespread fear. As prayers went unheard, many people's faith began to falter, questioning the church's divine power for the first time.
For centuries, the church insisted that only priests could understand the Bible, keeping it locked away in Latin. Brave translators like John Wycliffe and William Tyndale risked everything to translate the scriptures into languages everyone could read. Despite facing severe punishment, even execution, they fought to make the Word of God accessible to ordinary people. The church held tight to its power by keeping the Bible locked away, but the courage of these translators opened a path to freedom. In medieval times, the church often portrayed women as temptresses and fragile souls, casting them as dangers to men. Female scholars and leaders who made remarkable impacts were erased from the pages of history, silenced and forgotten. Nuns who dared to seek authority within the church hierarchy were often suppressed and pushed into silence. Even powerful queens with influence beyond borders were forced to bow before the church's male priests. This widespread gender injustice became one of the darkest hidden truths of the medieval church's history. By the 13th century, the Inquisition had become the church's deadliest weapon, wielded with ruthless purpose. Its goal was clear: to hunt down heretics, force confessions, and crush any form of dissent. Inquisitors traveled relentlessly from town to town, feared by many like executioners delivering grim justice. But the Inquisition wasn't about discovering truth. It was about spreading terror and ensuring obedience through fear of punishment. The Inquisition's torture chambers were filled with cruel devices meant to break bodies and spirits alike. The rack, the strappado, hot irons, and water torture were methods used to inflict unbearable pain. Victims were stretched, burned, and crushed, all to force them into confessing under unbearable torment. The church claimed that this earthly pain was a necessary price to save souls from eternal damnation. Burnings at the stake weren't hidden away. They were public events everyone could witness. People would gather in crowds, priests would preach, and the accused heretics were paraded through the streets. Then the flames would rise, consuming the condemned in a powerful but terrifying spectacle. All of this served a chilling purpose: to remind everyone of the supposed wrath of God and the church's ultimate power. In 1244, the Cathars, a peaceful Christian group who opposed the church's wealth, made their last stand at Montségur fortress in southern France. After months under siege, more than 200 Cathars faced a harsh fate, burned alive in a single brutal event. They were punished only for holding to a different faith, one the church sought to silence completely. For centuries, their story was erased from history, but today, the ruins still whisper their brave legacies. Long before the Reformation, a group called the Waldensians lived by simplicity, poverty, and reading scripture in their own languages. They challenged the established church, and for that they were branded as heretics. Entire villages were destroyed, and many were forced into hiding to keep their faith alive. Yet, no matter how hard they were silenced, the whispers of their belief never disappeared. Their story reminds us that the truth can never be completely buried, no matter the cost. In the early 15th century, Jan Hus bravely spoke out against corruption and abuse within the church. He was invited to the Council of Constance under a promise of safe passage, but his fate soon took a dark turn. Instead of safety, Hus was arrested, put on trial, and sentenced to death for his convictions. He was burned at the stake, standing firmly in his beliefs until the very end. With his final words, "Truth prevails," Hus left a legacy of courage that still inspires today. For centuries, the church didn't just silence religion. It also censored philosophy and science. Ideas from great thinkers like Aristotle and Galen were restricted, buried beneath strict control. Daring scholars like Roger Bacon, who explored optics and physics, faced severe consequences, even house arrest. This heavy censorship cast a long shadow, slowing progress and discovery for centuries. For centuries, people believed that Earth was the very center of everything, a truth fiercely protected by the church. But some early astronomers dared to suggest there was much more, a vast cosmos beyond our planet. Those brave enough to speak this truth often faced harsh consequences, forced to deny their discoveries or fall silent forever. The church clung to dogma, afraid that revealing the real universe might weaken its control over people's faith. In 1600, philosopher Giordano Bruno faced a tragic fate in Rome. His crime? Teaching that the universe is infinite and filled with countless worlds beyond our own. He boldly challenged the church's narrow view, insisting that stars were suns with their own planets. For his courage, Bruno was silenced by fire, a harsh punishment for daring ideas. His death became one of history's greatest symbols of intellectual injustice and the fight for knowledge. Back in medieval times, the church didn't just preach faith. It ruled with fear stronger than any sword. From the Inquisition to indulgences, fear of hell and punishment kept people in line. Fear wasn't just about pain. It was about control, making sure knowledge stayed locked away. The church's real power wasn't just holiness, it was ruling through terror dressed up as faith. Back in the Middle Ages, Europe was overflowing with holy relics. Everything from pieces of the true cross to feathers said to be from angels. Many of these relics were clear fakes, but that didn't stop pilgrims from traveling hundreds of miles and spending huge sums just to catch a glimpse. The church turned this devotion into a booming business, turning faith into a source of wealth like never before. Pilgrimages were once seen as sacred journeys to holy places, drawing countless travelers seeking spiritual fulfillment. But over time, these spiritual quests turned into booming industries thriving on the devotion of the faithful. Inns and merchants grew wealthy, while the peasants often spent all they had trying to complete their journey. Even the church encouraged endless pilgrimages, not just for faith, but to fill its coffers with growing wealth. The Crusades are often remembered as holy wars, but underneath they were battles for gold, land, and power. Looted treasures from Jerusalem, Constantinople, and across the Middle East flowed back into Europe in great caravans. While soldiers believed they fought for God, the church and nobles quietly filled their coffers with wealth and influence. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade set out to reclaim the Holy Land, but fate had a darker plan. Instead of reaching their sacred destination, the Crusaders turned against Constantinople, a fellow Christian city. They looted churches, destroyed priceless icons, and left devastation in their wake. This brutal attack shocked the Christian world, though the church tried to keep it quiet. Yet, the ruins of Constantinople tell a different story, one of betrayal and tragic conflict. Did you know that many medieval popes acted more like kings or warlords than spiritual leaders? They raised armies, led military campaigns, and sometimes even rode into battle themselves. The papal tiara wasn't just a symbol of faith. It was a powerful crown that represented their authority on and off the battlefield. Banners carrying the keys of St. Peter flew high, marking their leadership across both church and war. Their legacy reminds us that the line between spiritual and political power was once blurred like never before. Back in the 14th and 15th centuries, the papal court in Rome was known for something quite different than holiness. Instead of purity, the court was filled with corruption, bribes, lavish feasts, and secret political deals. Behind the scenes, cardinals and officials moved like shadows, entangled in power and greed. All of this scandal was hidden beneath sermons about faith and purity, masking the palace's true nature. Between 1309 and 1377, the center of the Catholic Church shifted from Rome to the city of Avignon in France. During this time, popes lived in incredible luxury, surrounded by wealth and grandeur. Meanwhile, ordinary Christians outside these walls often faced hardship and hunger. Critics of the era referred to this period as the Babylonian captivity of the church, highlighting the stark contrast. Interestingly, many documents revealing the true decadence of Avignon were destroyed or never preserved. Yet, through surviving artwork, we get a glimpse of the lavish feasts and opulence that defined this controversial chapter. Back in 1378, something incredible happened. Two rival popes were elected, one in Rome and another in Avignon. Each pope excommunicated the other, sparking a divide that tore across Europe for decades. People were caught in the middle, with angry crowds gathering outside grand cathedrals unsure who to trust. This scandal shook the very foundation of faith, but over time, official history softened the story, downplaying the chaos. Though priests and popes vow celibacy, many lived secret lives with mistresses and hidden children. Some monasteries became notorious for more than just prayer. They hid stories of abuse and corruption. These scandals were carefully erased from official records, protecting the church's public image. Behind the silence, a complicated and human story unfolds, hidden from view but never truly gone. Back in medieval times, despite the dangers, some satirists dared to poke fun at priests' indulgences and relics. They wrote secret plays and poems that exposed hypocrisy, risking everything to share their humor. Their works were often burned and their names erased from history, but they never stopped. This laughter was more than just jokes. It was the spark of rebellion against a system built on fear. By the late Middle Ages, fear of witches had gripped Europe like never before. The church played a major role, declaring women and healers as servants of Satan. This led to entire communities turning against their neighbors, driven by superstition and fear. Superstition wasn't just belief. It became a deadly tool of control wielded by the church. Back in 1487, two inquisitors wrote a book called the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches. This manual showed how to identify and persecute those accused of witchcraft. It became one of the most widely printed books of its time, second only to the Bible. The church used it to justify centuries of torture and executions. For centuries, midwives, herbalists, and widows faced harsh accusations, not for crimes, but for their independence and knowledge. Their healing arts were misunderstood and branded as sorcery by powerful institutions. This wasn't just a witch hunt. It was a gendered war aimed at silencing women who dared to live beyond the church's control. In the past, accused witches endured brutal torture, forced to confess no matter their innocence. Under unbearable pain, they named others, spreading fear and suspicion throughout the towns. This created a terrifying cycle. More confessions led to more trials and more tragic executions. While the church claimed victory over evil, entire generations of women were lost to this fear. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, tens of thousands of people were accused of witchcraft and punished by fire. Entire villages watched as their neighbors, once familiar faces, were burned at the stake in the name of supposed justice. But history never recorded the true number of innocent lives lost to these flames. In the 14th century, the Black Death swept through Europe, wiping out nearly half the population in its terrifying path. With no cure or explanation, people desperately turned to the church for hope and answers. But the priests and bishops had none, instead labeling the plague as God's punishment for sin. This response avoided responsibility and only deepened the fear and despair ravaging communities. In medieval times, when the plague swept across Europe, many were desperate for answers. Unable to explain the disease, some church leaders wrongly blamed Jewish communities for poisoning wells. This false accusation led to horrific pogroms where thousands of Jewish people were massacred. Tragically, the church played a big part in spreading these hateful ideas, fueling centuries of anti-Semitism. And even through history, the true role of these leaders was often hidden or erased from records. Remembering these stories helps us confront the past honestly and stand against hatred today. During times of great suffering, bands of flagellants roamed towns, whipping themselves in desperate hope that pain could stop the plague. At first, the church allowed these rituals, but soon grew wary of their growing independence from official religious practices. Eventually, the church condemned the flagellants, fearing the chaos they spread and their challenge to traditional authority. This chaotic movement revealed just how powerless the church was to control the fear and suffering ravaging society. After the plague swept through, many people saw that the church hadn't really been there for them. Priests deserted their posts and monasteries shut their doors, leaving communities without spiritual support. The promises of divine protection broke down, shaking the very foundation of people's faith. In response, the church tightened its grip, trying to suppress the growing doubts and fears. For centuries, the church rewrote its role during the plague and witch hunts, shaping the story to fit their narrative. What we find in history books is often a carefully crafted version of events, one that softens failures and exaggerates guidance. Behind the faded ink and fragile pages, the real stories of suffering, scapegoats, and hypocrisy were hidden away. These truths were locked away from generations, buried deep beneath the surface of what we were told. In medieval Europe, even a whisper of heresy could call someone before secret church courts. These trials were held in secrecy, without witnesses or a fair chance to defend oneself. A single accusation could mean lifelong imprisonment or even a death sentence. This system was designed to silence any opposition before it could grow. Not all who opposed the church were rebels. Some were mystics who shared deeply personal visions of God. Women like Marguerite Porete faced persecution, even death, for teaching that God's love was beyond the laws set by the church. The church feared those who reached the divine directly, bypassing traditional authority and sacred rules. Back in the day, as people's curiosity about the natural world grew, the church started to push back hard. Thinkers exploring new ideas in medicine, astronomy, or physics risked being labeled heretics. Simply seeking the truth became a dangerous act, full of fear and uncertainty. Knowledge was trapped, held back by the threat of excommunication and punishment. Though the church publicly condemned astrology behind closed doors, star charts quietly influenced important decisions. While stargazers faced punishment in public, popes and bishops secretly turned to the stars for guidance. This hidden reliance shows a fascinating hypocrisy, where faith and the cosmos intertwined in secrecy. Beneath sermons condemning sin, the light of the stars quietly shaped the church's path. In medieval times, cathedrals soared higher and cloisters became more ornate, while many peasants lived in hardship. Behind these impressive walls, the church stored immense treasures, from shining gold chalices to priceless relics. These riches were locked away in dark, heavily guarded vaults, hidden from the outside world. Meanwhile, peasants toiled in the fields and around the cathedrals, facing poverty despite the church's wealth. Though the treasure was protected as something sacred, it often served as a symbol of exploitation dressed in holy robes. In the past, even death came with a price tag. The church charged fees for funerals, burials, and prayers for souls in purgatory. Families already grieving were forced to pay, believing their loved one's afterlife depended on it. What should have been a time of mourning turned into a somber business transaction. Back in history, purgatory wasn't just a spiritual idea, it became one of the church's most profitable inventions. The promise was simple: pay up, and you could reduce the suffering your soul might face after death. Indulgences and prayers for the dead turned into a form of spiritual blackmail, pushing the poor into endless payments. Behind this, dramatic images of purgatory flames captured the fear that made this system work so well. It's a striking reminder of how faith and profit once collided, affecting countless lives. Monasteries were meant to be sacred places of peace and devotion, but history tells a different story. Behind these walls, scandals unfolded. Corruption, abuse, and hidden wealth amassed in silence. Monks who swore to live by strict vows often broke them, their misdeeds quietly buried by those around them. And to protect its sacred image, the church carefully erased the uncomfortable truths from its chronicles. Back in the day, knowledge was seen as dangerous, and countless books were burned. Libraries filled with groundbreaking works on medicine, philosophy, and astronomy were destroyed. Each fire erased centuries of wisdom, holding back progress for generations to come. Scholars mourned the loss of invaluable knowledge, powerless as history went up in smoke. This was the price of fear. The destruction of books meant the destruction of our future. By the late Middle Ages, cracks began to form within the church. Whispered voices started questioning indulgences, papal power, and corruption. Small movements like the Hussites and Lollards planted seeds of defiance. Though the church tried to crush them, these quiet voices couldn't be silenced. These seeds would one day grow into the fire that became the Reformation. Back in the 15th century, indulgences had turned into the church's biggest money-making scheme. Priests were basically selling forgiveness, like merchants selling fresh bread at the market. Rich people could just buy their way out of sin, while the poor had no choice but to suffer. It was as if heaven itself was up for sale, all for the highest bidder. Tetzel, a Dominican friar, became infamous for selling indulgences with catchy slogans to promise quick salvation. His famous line went, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." This bold sales pitch enraged ordinary people who felt exploited and unheard. Ultimately, Tetzel's actions stirred the anger that fueled Martin Luther's call for reform. A lot of the money from indulgences didn't go to helping the poor or easing suffering. Instead, it was used to build grand palaces and the magnificent St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. This greatest church in Christendom was funded not by pure faith, but by the widespread fear of purgatory. Marble blocks and craftsmen's hands show the immense effort behind its creation. So what you see in grand churches isn't just faith, it's a story shaped by power and fear. Cardinals lived like princes, draped in rich velvet robes and surrounded by grandeur. They hosted lavish banquets, indulging in fine food on gold-plated dishes while the world outside struggled. Holding multiple powerful roles, they drew wealth from several regions at once, amassing great fortunes. Meanwhile, outside cathedral gates, peasants begged for bread, starving in stark contrast to the cardinal's feast. Did you know that many popes appointed their own family members to powerful church positions? These men weren't chosen for their holiness, but for their loyalty to the pope. In fact, the papacy became more like a family dynasty than a spiritual office. God's house turned into a hereditary empire, ruled by bloodlines rather than faith. The Borgia family dominated the papacy in the late 1400s, turning Rome into a hotbed of scandal. Their name became synonymous with murder, poison, bribery, and forbidden desire. Among the most infamous were Cesare Borgia, a ruthless warrior, and Lucrezia Borgia, whose portraits hint at a complex legacy. Yet many of their darkest secrets were carefully hidden away, locked in the vaults of the Vatican archives. Their story is a timeless reminder of power, betrayal, and mystery beneath the surface of history. Did you know some popes weren't chosen by divine will but by bribery and power plays? Rival factions paid fortunes, battling for control over the highest office in Christianity. The papal throne was essentially sold to the highest bidder, a costly auction for spiritual leadership. During the Renaissance, popes shifted their focus from pure faith to art, architecture, and personal fame. They famously hired masters like Michelangelo and Raphael to create timeless masterpieces. But behind the scenes, life at the Vatican was often far from holy. Popes were known to host lavish parties, father children, and even lead armies into battle. In many ways, the so-called Holy Father was one of Rome's most worldly and controversial figures. As corruption spread through the land, secret groups began to rise in the shadows. Brotherhoods, mystics, and scholars met in hidden places, united by a shared purpose. They risked everything to protect forbidden knowledge from being lost forever. By the dawn of the 16th century, the Church's lies were spreading like wildfire, and Europe was ready for change. Indulgences, corruption, and hypocrisy had pushed people to their limits, fueling whispers of rebellion. Then, a determined monk named Martin Luther decided it was time to strike the match and ignite the fire of reform. Back in 1517, Martin Luther, a German monk, saw something he just couldn't ignore: the sale of indulgences. Determined to speak out, he hammered his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. His bold actions caught everyone's attention, sparking surprise and curiosity in the townsfolk. Unlike earlier rebels, Luther had a powerful ally: the printing press, which changed everything. His writings spread across Europe faster than the church could burn them. For the first time, everyday people could read powerful ideas in their own language. Knowledge became a weapon that ignited change and challenged old powers. In 1521, Martin Luther faced intense pressure from the church to recant his beliefs. Angry bishops and church leaders demanded he betray his convictions. But Luther boldly refused, declaring, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Though excommunicated, his courage sparked a movement that inspired millions. For centuries, the Bible was locked away in Latin, understood only by the church elite. Then Luther translated it into German, opening the door for everyday people to read it themselves. Peasants and townsfolk gathered, reading aloud and discovering new truths for the very first time. The church, feeling threatened, tried to snatch these translations and silence the movement. But the power had shifted. People now had the truth in their own hands. Back in the 16th century, German peasants, inspired by calls for reform, decided to stand up against both their lords and bishops. They demanded freedom, justice, and equality under God, hopeful for a fairer future. But their uprising was met with overwhelming force as well-organized armies moved in to crush the rebellion. Villages were burned to the ground and countless peasants were brutally slaughtered, all with the church's blessing. It was a tragic moment where hope for change met a harsh reality of power and control. Luther's movement sparked a wave of change across Europe that no one could ignore. In Switzerland, Ulrich Zwingli started preaching new ideas that challenged old traditions. Meanwhile, in France, John Calvin called for even stricter faith and discipline in the church. From these movements, new Protestant churches emerged, changing the religious landscape forever. For the first time in 1,000 years, the church's long-held monopoly was broken. When the Catholic Church faced growing challenges, it launched the Counter-Reformation to reclaim its influence and power. New religious orders like the Jesuits emerged, dedicated to defending the Pope's authority and spreading Catholic teachings worldwide. The Church's fight wasn't just spiritual. It mirrored the intensity of any battlefield as forces marched under papal banners. This fierce war for souls shaped history, blending faith, power, and unyielding determination. Between 1545 and 1563, the Church gathered at the Council of Trent to tackle widespread corruption and reform its practices. Bishops and clergy can be seen debating passionately, trying to decide the future direction of the Church. While some reforms were introduced, key issues like indulgences and the authority of the Pope remained firmly in place. Rather than admitting fault, the Church took a hard stance against Protestants, condemning them as enemies of God. Across Europe, from France to Germany, faith once united now tore people apart. Catholics and Protestants clashed violently, fighting bitter wars in the name of God. Cities burned to ash, and rivers ran red with the blood of those caught in the conflict. Families were torn apart, communities shattered, and peace seemed a distant dream. All because the Church's greed and corruption led not to salvation, but to centuries of war. Even amid the chaos of war, the Church was quietly pulling strings behind closed doors. Secret alliances were forged, deals sealed with bribes, and enemies eliminated through silent assassinations. While Europe suffered on the battlefield, Rome carefully safeguarded its wealth and influence. At this point, religion was less about faith and more about the complex game of power politics. In 1572, Paris became the stage for a tragic event where thousands of Protestants were brutally killed overnight. The violence quickly spread beyond the city, rippling through the kingdom and destroying entire families. While the church hailed these killings as a victory for Catholicism, the rivers of blood told a much bleaker story. This was a brutal reminder of how faith, when twisted into a weapon, can bring unimaginable suffering. The Spanish Inquisition, founded way back in 1478, is remembered as one of history's most ruthless institutions. It targeted Jews, Muslims, Protestants, and anyone suspected of heresy, casting a wide and terrifying net. Torture chambers operated relentlessly, aiming to extract confessions and punish dissent. Public punishments called auto da fe turned executions into horrifying spectacles witnessed by crowds. This grim chapter reminds us how fear and power can rewrite the course of history. Back in 1492, Spain's rulers, supported by the church, demanded that Jews and Muslims either convert or leave the country. Hundreds of thousands faced exile, forced to abandon their homes and everything they owned behind. Many didn't survive the harsh journey, their only fault being the faith they were born into. As Spain and Portugal set sail for the New World, their ships crossed the vast Atlantic Ocean carrying more than just explorers. Alongside conquistadors came missionaries who baptized indigenous peoples often under threat, forever changing their lives. Temples burned and ancient traditions were erased as new beliefs were forced upon millions in the name of salvation. Back in the Americas, the church supported the encomienda system, where indigenous people were forced into labor for Spanish landowners. Priests said this system was about saving souls, but the reality was harsh: endless suffering and loss for native communities. Behind this painful history stand dark, somber mission churches, symbols of a complicated and troubled past. In the 16th and 17th centuries, witch hunts swept across Europe, leaving fear in their wake. Entire villages in Germany and Scotland faced tragedies where dozens were executed in a single day. These trials often depended on strange and unfounded evidence, like a wart, a dream, or just a rumor. Thousands of innocent people lost their lives for crimes that simply never existed. In 1618, religious tensions ignited one of Europe's deadliest conflicts, the 30 Years' War. Catholic and Protestant armies clashed, devastating towns and tearing communities apart. Millions suffered from famine and disease as the war raged across the continent. While the church claimed it fought for God, the true battle was for political dominance. One of the darkest moments in war history happened in 1631, when Catholic forces attacked the Protestant city of Magdeburg. Over 20,000 innocent civilians were massacred in just a single day, a devastating loss of life. Before the violence began, priests blessed the soldiers, showing how faith was used to disguise pure bloodlust. After the attack, soldiers looted homes and burned what was left, leaving nothing behind but destruction. While armies clashed on open battlefields, the Jesuits were quietly shaping the world from the shadows. Highly educated and fiercely determined, they spread Catholic teachings far and wide, from Europe to the New World. They weren't just teachers. They acted as spies and strategists, making sure the Pope's reach extended to every corner of the globe. After decades of conflict, the 30 Years' War finally came to an end in 1648 with the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia. The agreement reshaped Europe's map, redrawing borders and creating a new balance of power. It also forced nations to tolerate different Protestant faiths, breaking the Church's hopes for total control. Though the Church lost absolute control, its influence in politics and culture remained strong for centuries to come. In the late 1600s, a wave of new thinkers began to challenge old beliefs with bold ideas. They believed reason and evidence should guide us, not just faith or tradition. These Enlightenment thinkers laid the foundation for modern freedom and knowledge. Back in the 1600s, the Church tried to silence a revolutionary idea about our place in the universe. Galileo supported heliocentrism, the sun at the center with Earth revolving around it, a bold challenge to long-held beliefs. In 1633, he was dragged before the Inquisition, forced to recant his groundbreaking discoveries. Despite his punishment and house arrest, Galileo's courage paved the way for modern science. His real crime, sharing the truth about our universe no matter the cost. Back in history, the Church made a list called the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, banning books they didn't want people to read. From groundbreaking science to deep philosophical ideas, thousands of titles were labeled dangerous and forbidden. Reading or owning these books wasn't just discouraged, it was seen as a sin, and punishments were very real. Scholars and readers had to hide their manuscripts and ideas in the shadows, risking everything for knowledge. Voltaire wasn't afraid to use sharp wit and satire to expose the corruption of the Church. Because of his daring words, his works were burned, his plays were banned, and he was even exiled from society. But despite the crackdowns, Voltaire's powerful ideas about freedom of speech and thought spread like wildfire. His words slowly broke the iron grip the church held on European minds, inspiring change across the continent. In Paris and beyond, salons blossomed into vibrant hubs where intellectuals gathered to share and challenge bold ideas. Behind closed doors, writers, scientists, and philosophers debated thoughts that were often forbidden in public. These gatherings were often hosted by women who held incredible influence despite the church's attempts to silence them. Together in these secret circles, ideas took flight and sparked the engines of revolution across nations. During the Enlightenment, secret societies like the Freemasons quietly grew in influence. They created spaces free from church control, where ideas about liberty, equality, and brotherhood could blossom. Though the church condemned them as satanic, these groups inspired powerful new ways of thinking. Their ideals eventually helped spark revolutions that changed the world forever. For centuries, outdated teachings kept medical knowledge stuck, with the church forbidding dissections and experiments. But during the Enlightenment, doctors bravely challenged these limits, exploring anatomy and developing surgery techniques. Even as faith resisted, scientific discoveries like vaccines began to save lives, transforming healthcare forever. While Enlightenment ideas brightened Europe, the church was already expanding its reach abroad. Missionary schools took root in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, often enforcing strict uniforms and new customs on native children. Traditional temples and sacred sites were replaced or overshadowed by crosses and Western architecture. The message was mixed, preaching love, but often spreading control and cultural erasure. During the Enlightenment, new ideas about freedom and equality began to challenge the old ways. In both America and France, people stood up to kings and rulers, demanding a life free from tyranny. One of the most iconic moments was the storming of the Bastille, a symbol of royal oppression in France. Across the ocean, Americans declared their independence, creating new documents that would inspire freedom worldwide. But these calls for liberty also challenged the power of the church, long linked with kings and empires. This powerful shift set the stage for modern democracies and the ongoing fight for human rights. During the French Revolution, anger exploded against the church like never before. Priests were driven out or even executed, while monasteries were shut down across the country. The revolutionaries also seized church lands, claiming them for the people. For centuries, the church had quietly held onto its dark and hidden power. But now, the fury of the people tore away the mask with fire and guillotines. Napoleon saw the church as both a challenge and a chance to strengthen his rule. He signed an agreement with the Pope to bring Catholicism back to France, but kept tight control over it. When the Pope resisted fully obeying him, Napoleon didn't hesitate to send troops to keep things in line. Eventually, the Pope was taken prisoner in Rome, showing just how far Napoleon would go to hold power. Even after revolutions swept through the land, the church didn't just lose its place. It found ways to come back stronger. Through careful diplomacy, the Vatican negotiated with monarchs all over Europe, making deals that couldn't be ignored. What was taken away during the chaos was quietly returned, often through financial agreements and political strategy. As cities expanded and factories multiplied, many workers found themselves trapped in poverty and hardship. Children were often part of this labor force, facing long hours and tough conditions that few could escape. The church stepped in, claiming to protect the poor and offer hope amidst the struggle. But more often than not, it encouraged obedience instead of uprising, aligning with those in power. This message helped keep the working class quiet, even while their lives were defined by hardship and inequality. The 19th century was a time of groundbreaking discoveries that shook the world, from evolution and geology to the mysteries of electricity. In 1859, Charles Darwin's Origin of Species challenged the church's traditional creation story like never before. This new idea of evolution sparked fierce debates as the church condemned it as heresy, fearing the loss of ancient teachings. The clash between science and faith marked a turning point, reshaping how we understand our world and origins. Back in 1864, Pope Pius IX released the Syllabus of Errors, a document that pushed back hard against modern ideas like freedom of religion and democracy. This bold decree reflected the church's deep unease about a changing world and the growing push for progress. Rather than embracing these new ideas, the church labeled many of them as dangerous errors that threatened their authority. It was a clear stand, a clash between centuries-old traditions and the unstoppable wave of modern thought. This moment marked a significant chapter in history, reminding us how progress often faces resistance from the powers that be. Back in 1870, the First Vatican Council made a powerful declaration. The Pope was infallible when it came to matters of faith. This meant that the Pope's word could never be wrong on spiritual teachings, a bold move that shook up the church. At the same time, countries across Europe were starting to break away from church control. making this declaration even more significant. The papal crown, representing authority, seemed to glow with new power, marking a turning point in religious history. During the scramble for Africa, missionaries often marched alongside colonizers, joining a force that changed the continent forever. Crosses were planted right next to imperial flags, symbolizing the close link between faith and empire building. Conversion was frequently enforced through mission schools and labor camps, where indigenous traditions were suppressed under strict control. Ancient African customs and sacred shrines were often destroyed or abandoned as the church's influence grew alongside imperial power. This chapter of history reveals how religion was used to justify empire's cruelty, forever altering Africa's cultural landscape. By the late 19th century, the Vatican wasn't just a spiritual center. It had become a powerful political state. It struck deals with kings and influenced governments across Europe. Through careful negotiation, Catholic monarchies remained loyal to Rome first, sometimes over their own people. As Freemasons, revolutionaries, and secular thinkers grew louder, their calls to challenge the Vatican became impossible to ignore. Secret meetings took place in shadowy rooms where ideas about separating church and state were passionately debated. Burning effigies of religious leaders symbolized the fierce resistance to the church's authority. Though the church labeled them as satanic forces, the grip it once held was clearly slipping away. In 1870, Italian revolutionaries marched into Rome, ending centuries of papal territorial power. Papal guards retreated as the city was taken, marking the end of an era for the Vatican's earthly control. The Pope declared himself a prisoner in the Vatican, locked away from the outside world. Though stripped of its lands, the Church's hidden spiritual influence remained strong and enduring. As Europe plunged into war in 1914, the Vatican declared itself neutral, standing apart from the chaos. But behind closed doors, papal envoys quietly traveled, negotiating with both sides to safeguard the Church's influence. Secret documents were exchanged in hushed meetings, revealing a faith focused less on peace and more on survival. In this turbulent time, the Vatican balanced diplomacy and discretion, trying to ensure the Church endured no matter the war's outcome. Back in the early 1900s, the Vatican set up financial institutions to protect its vast wealth. One of the most infamous was the Vatican Bank, known for its secrecy and complex money flows. Rumors of money laundering and hidden funds spread, linking the Church's finances to global political influence. This wasn't just religion or finance, it was a shadow power blending both worlds behind closed doors. After years of separation, Mussolini made a groundbreaking agreement with the Vatican. This treaty not only created Vatican City as its own independent state, but also gave it immense wealth and sovereignty. With this deal, the Church regained strong political influence, supported by a powerful dictator. During World War II, the Vatican officially stayed neutral, but history shows a far more complicated story beneath the surface. While some priests bravely risked everything to hide and protect Jewish families, others remained silent or even supported the fascist regimes. Behind the scenes, Vatican officials walked a delicate line, balancing moral responsibility with the harsh realities of survival in a war-torn world. After the war ended, a hidden network helped Nazi officials slip away under the radar. These secret routes, known as rat lines, were disguised as charitable missions to avoid suspicion. Even Vatican clergy played a part, sometimes moving in disguise to protect these fugitives. In the end, justice was overlooked, hidden behind political alliances and covert missions. Back in the 1960s, Pope John XXIII sparked a major shift with Vatican II, aiming to refresh the way worship and scripture translations were done. The council brought new languages into Mass, opening doors for many believers around the world to connect more personally with their faith. But while it felt like a breath of fresh air, some said these changes were just skin-deep, masking the same old traditions beneath modern rituals. Vatican II reshaped relations not only within the Church but also with other religions, setting the stage for dialogue and understanding in a changing world. In the end, Vatican II remains a landmark moment, balancing tradition and renewal in the heart of the Catholic Church. As the 20th century progressed, shocking scandals began to surface within the Church. Priests accused of serious crimes were often shielded by bishops and quietly moved between parishes. Behind the scenes, Vatican secrecy kept many truths hidden from the public eye. For decades, the victims' voices were ignored, silenced by an institution afraid to face the truth. Back in the 1980s, the Vatican Bank became the center of a storm, tangled in allegations of money laundering and mafia connections. Behind the scenes, shadowy figures linked to organized crime lurked in the background, deepening the mystery. One chilling tragedy stands out. Roberto Calvi, a banker found hanging beneath London's Blackfriars Bridge, a death shrouded in suspicion. The truth about the Church's finances was hidden behind layers of secrecy, layers that some paid for with their lives. Today, the Church has billions of followers around the world, shaping lives in countless ways. It operates schools, hospitals, and charities, making a real difference in many communities. But beyond these visible acts of kindness, the church holds vast land, wealth, and political influence. Even as scandals have challenged its image, the true extent of its hidden power is much stronger than many think. From the brutal gladiator games in ancient Rome to the relentless inquisitors of the medieval era, the church has wielded hidden power behind the scenes for nearly 2 millennia. It has shaped empires, silencing voices that stood in its way, and rewritten history while wrapped in a mantle of faith. Today, whispers of scandal and secret influence still linger. But the real question is how much of this hidden power still controls our world now. Behind the silence and shadows, the Vatican's lights glow quietly at night. For centuries, the church has hidden its dark power, shaping kings, silencing science, blessing bloodshed. Empires have risen and fallen, yet the Vatican still stands. Was it faith that kept it alive, or power? As long as secrets remain locked in its archives, perhaps the real history of the church and its grip on our world is still hidden in the shadows. History is written by the victors, but truth never dies.